Hello and welcome to a bonus edition of the Athletic FC Tactics podcast. I'm your host, Duncan Alexander. Today, we're going to look at pressing. What is pressing? What does it involve in the modern game? Who does it well? Who doesn't do it well? And how much has it changed from when, I guess, your dad probably just called it closing down? Joining me today are two people who love to close down lanes. They are Mark Carey and Liam Tharme.
Hello, Duncan. Hello, Mark.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, Liam, can you give us like a basic overview of what exactly we mean when we say pressing in the year 2025? What does it involve and why do teams do it or not do it, as the case may be?
Well, I've tried to define it in kind of the most scientific-y way possible, as I thought. It was quite an interesting thing to kind of ruminate on of what actually is it, because we often can say, we think we know when we see it, but to actually say kind of measuring it, and that's often a challenge for data collectors and even Mark and our data team here when we're looking at these stats and measuring it. Here's the definition I've come up with: as a deliberate and coordinated attempt by one or more players, and in brackets that's typically two or more, to reduce time, space and options for opponents with the intention of forcing them into a turnover, a mistake, or simply a decision that they don't want to make. And primarily this is done to try and recover the ball closer to the opposition goal.
I like it.
I like it. Yeah, I think that the key bit there is saying like two or more, or at least one or more. That there's an element to which you need to kind of talk about synchrony or coordination. Yeah. I think, you can have many players individually applying pressure, but a coordinated press and a good press is when it kind of all works in tandem, in synchrony. And of course you can have a coordinated press for multiple different reasons, and we'll come on to, I guess, pressing triggers with that as well. And it might be when the ball goes backwards from the opponent. It might be when it goes out to a fullback, whatever it may be. But I think that the important thing to say in terms of a press going well is the synchronization of it all kind of coming together and condensing those spaces. Because
very often it's not the person actually directly applying pressure on the ball carrier or the passer that gets the ball back. Sometimes it can be if they make a tackle, but often they're forcing a bad pass or a mistake, and it's someone following up elsewhere on the pitch that actually makes a tackle or lands on that second ball, wins the aerial duel. So it is very much a team effort.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a very common thing in football is to kind of just watch the ball, see where the ball's going and look at that sort of stuff. I mean, I think with pressing, measuring it, we kind of all know what it looks like, I think, but how do we measure it? And because it's one of those slightly nebulous concepts. So I'm looking at you, Mark.
Yeah, well, I'm looking straight back at you because I almost want you to check what my answers are here, because of course, need your help. From a data perspective, I think there's a few ways that you can go about it. I think often we've got a lot of metrics that are proxies for pressing, to Liam's point before, is that it's actually sometimes quite difficult to really have a uniform sort of definition for it. But the first half, I suppose, is kind of just simple counting statistics. I think just looking at how often a team performs a certain action, and then you can use that as a proxy to say that they like to do this action more. So, for example, if you're looking at high pressing, you can look at the number of possessions won in the attacking third, and it indicates that a team wants to be really aggressive in their actions. And as I say, if you've got a higher number, you can sort of see that that's a bit more of an indicator of process as much as anything. I think a lot of people will be familiar now with the metric passes per defensive action, PPDA, which essentially counts how many passes a team allows the opposition to make before they attempt to win the ball back themselves and make a defensive action, be it a tackle, a block, a interception, clearance, etc. It's important to note with this metric specifically, for the most part, it's from the attacking 60% of the pitch, so almost from the edge of your own center circle, if you like, in your own half forward. So it kind of gives a bit more of an indication of that you're sort of looking forward in the press rather than just pressing in your own 6-yard box where you're sort of obliged to, because you might concede a shot there. So PPDA is another one. But I think it is interesting that there's more complex methods that are emerging with the emergence of the combination of tracking data and event data to just simply look at just, again, the process, what more players and teams look to do. So we use data from footer vision at the Athletic, and there's certain things like even just pressures on the opposition goalkeeper and double pressures, looking to go from one maybe centre back to the other, looking at the average speed of that pressure, the average height of that pressure, to really try and sort of hone in a little bit more. And it kind of speaks to the answer that Liam gave before in terms of the wider conversation of measuring pressing and defining pressing itself, is that I've been speaking a lot with another data provider called Skill Corner, And they were really trying to get a really clear as they can definition of what it is when we're talking about a press in terms of the angle that you're coming at it from, the speed of the run that you're coming at it from, how many options within that run that you're then cutting off for the opposition player to make a pass. You might not make a defensive action, but you are sort of blocking these passing lanes. You're maybe forcing the player backwards as well. So it's a long-winded way to say that I think there's multiple different ways that you can measure it. And we've gone from maybe a bit more simple in terms of counting statistics to more complex with the richness of data that you can have.
I still think the simple ways currently, at least with the event data, are probably the best. It's probably a bit of a falling point of how we have event data in regards to defensive actions, where it's still a lot of kind of on ball stuff. Of course, it depends how much an opposition team want to play out, how much you get an opportunity to press. It's also one of the challenges with perhaps PPDA sometimes, that it can be often how many passes you allow a team or how many passes they're prepared to make. If it's perhaps Crystal Palace or Nottingham Forest that don't want to be hugely expansive all the time from the back, opposition teams might have a lower PPDA against them, not because they're pressing more, but because the keeper is just kicking it long. And I've seen other ways of doing this, for instance, like teams looking at their own kind of build-ups or sequences from their own goalkeeper, kind of counting the number of passes it takes them, whether they get over the halfway line, and if they don't, where kind of in your own half does that sequence break down. You can reverse engineer that and look at where are we making the turnovers, within how many passes, is this kind of immediately within 2 or 3, or is it a slightly longer sequence? So there's lots of different ways, but I still think the simple, even just counting, as Mark's kind of final third weekends or high turnovers, generally speaking, tends to match up with the eye test pretty well. So I think that's fine, really, despite all those advancements that do give a lot more granular data, but just to get that kind of overview and snapshot is more than good enough.
And do you think we can compare different leagues easily? Does some leagues press more than others? Is it different, like at the top of some leagues compared to the bottom? Is the Premier League more homogenous? What have you seen there?
I think it's really difficult to compare across leagues in a lot of things, really, when you're looking at maybe a single metric or a single part of the game, because there's so much diversity and heterogeneity within each league, really. And I know that, as you say, some leagues are a little bit more similar within, but pressing being a good example of that. You could talk about so many different other styles of play. But if you're talking about the Premier League, for example, you've got Nottingham Forest, if you're talking about pressing, who like to sit in more of a low block, spring forward from a counter-attacking perspective. And then of a similar kind of level in the league, you've got someone like Bournemouth, who are completely the opposite. They like to really press high, go man for man, and make sure they try and win the ball back high and then go forward from there. And we're probably going to use those two examples for the rest of this episode as well, because they are good use cases. And then, as I say, you can compare that with multiple different examples across different leagues. There's probably more similarity maybe between certain leagues. So maybe the Bundesliga and the Premier League, for how kind of transitional they are and how physical they are, compared to maybe Serie A and La Liga. Broad brushstroke being a little bit more sort of making sure that the space is a bit more condensed in certain areas rather than necessarily opening the game up. Ligue 1, you'd be able to comment a little bit more on, Liam, but there's again probably a heterogeneity in there as well.
Yeah, I think so. That's quite a good league actually for being physical, and it's one of the reasons why I think centre-backs especially get exposed to a lot of 1v1 duels, defending high up the pitch when teams are pressing, and then they can kind of transfer so well from that league, it seems, more than other leagues. I think there's been a lot, you have to look at it as well where the coaching, either influence or kind of, acquisition comes from. A lot of it is Bundesliga coaches when, Klopp came over as well. There's a lot of German coaches, Italian coaches in the Premier League currently and kind of historically as well. So it's just a thing, I suppose, where you go, you might not get those influences from elsewhere in Europe, even if they're there, because the coaches might not be bringing them across. We've now got a rise of a few kind of French coaches or Francophone coaches that are coming over. That might change things, how they look in kind of 5-6 years' time. So as we've seen with kind of perhaps Jurgen Klopp, it only kind of takes one person to come over with really strong ideas, have some success, and coaches seem very open to adopting those and making them their own.
Nice. You've mentioned a few kind of different approaches there. What are the sort of basic / common pressing structures? We all know that you'll see people on social media now after games talking about their team's out of possession setup. So what are the sort of gold standards?
I think structure might be the wrong word to use in this context, only because it's probably not how coaches, analysts, people professionally in clubs are looking at it, because they're not intending to set up in a certain shape. It's more about principles of how many bodies do you want to commit forward? Where are you basically prepared to be balanced? Where do you want to be player for player or man for man? Where do you want to have an overload, so one or more players in your favour? And where are you prepared to be underloaded or to give up an overload and let your position have more players? a lot of the time now we see a lot of teams saying, we'll go man for man, we'll match you 1v1 all over the pitch. And that might involve pushing a centre-back further forward, or sometimes you see a wing-back or a full-back going all the way to press the opposition wing-back or full-back if perhaps the winger is marking a centre-back instead. But a lot of the time you'll also see kind of a 2v1 at the back, what coaches like to call a +1 at the back. So kind of keeping your two centre-backs up against an opposition striker. And then that normally means your striker might have to press on their own. So you kind of get those balances within it. I think in terms of defensive shape, we see the 4-4-2 now quite commonly. It was a piece I wrote probably about a year ago now, largely off of kind of Arsenal, the success they'd had there of being really compact that way. And I think that was a useful shape for kind of being more in a block, because it helped you match up well against different back threes, back fours. It was quite balanced. You could adapt it quite easily. And it was then quite straightforward to press out of. You could squeeze up, push forward. The front two could step up and the wingers could back them up. That it was very easy to have across kind of different forms. And I think, I can't remember what the quote is from Wenger, but there's something about that being the most balanced formation in terms of actually matching up the pitch dimensions or something like that, which feels like a very Arsene Wenger comment to have made anyway.
Especially because in the modern day, I suppose it's always been the case, but there's been a real fixation of making sure that there's no space in the centre of the pitch as well. And Arsenal have been a really key sort of advocate and really like gold standard, I think, in that regard. On the player for player example, I think it's maybe worth talking about as well, because I think it's interesting in terms of kind of going all the way and everyone going player for player, whether it's going sort of forward or maybe pinning more to one side. Is it the case that it's almost like you mitigate the fact that you might be underloaded on another side simply because if the ball were to get released, you've got enough time to kind of get across, because it has to be a long ball of which you then can shuffle over in time. So actually it looks really risky because everyone is kind of matching up one for one. Yeah. But knowing that the ball's the thing that's kind of the most important here. And if it were to kind of get released, there's time to shuffle back.
Which speaks, I guess, to the amount of, preparation and research and work that teams do during the week for different games and different scenarios. So on that basis, let's kind of talk about who's good at it and maybe a few clubs who are less good.
Yeah, I think I guess I touched upon it before in terms of Arsenal in the past 3 seasons, I think it's fair to say, under Arteta have been the gold standard for it for the reasons that we spoke about before in terms of a 4-4-2. Sometimes for certain teams going more to a 4-2-4, but I think Arsenal, that's been one of their main strengths for all that you can talk about them in terms of scoring goals. I remember writing a piece about this, that actually their method to score goals as well is their really coordinated and aggressive press, because they really almost strangle the opposition to make sure that they can't build out and then sort of win it high up and hopefully go on to score from there. So they've been really good examples of it in recent years across Europe. Paris Saint-Germain as well. I mean, it was a theme across the whole of their season, but specifically in the Champions League as well. It was kind of on show against really the elite sides, and they really profited from it, obviously, to win the Champions League. I know you got some examples, Liam.
Yeah. I think it's something we've seen in the Premier League with kind of all the title winners, with Liverpool under Klopp. City, when they won the Champions League as well, had a really good aggressive press with these wingers, basically being into a 4-2-4, if you want to look at it as a shape, and making these curved runs to press centre-backs and, really lock teams in. I thought PSG were really interesting because they kind of tweaked their press a tiny bit throughout Europe last season. They started off going very man for man. It was super aggressive. Worked for them by the end of the league phase. They struggled a bit early on, but it kind of clicked. And I mean, a big part of that owed to Ousmane Dembele is the number 9. There's that kind of gif that still circulates on social media now of him stood waiting on the edge of the 18-yard box, like staring at the goalkeeper, quite scarily, quite obsessively. He's just so locked in and ready to press. And we've got a visualization that can help people kind of understand how that looked. Where Achraf Hakimi, the right back, would often be making that jump I mentioned earlier, of going all the way from fullback to fullback. But they adjusted it kind of deeper, and I think the first time I saw this was against Aston Villa in the quarterfinals, where they actually kept Nuno Mendes, the left back, a little bit deeper. They wanted that +1. My logic in that game specifically was Villa can be quite a good vertical team. They've got Ollie Watkins to run in behind. They've got number 10s in Morgan Rogers. I think John McGinn played as well. So I was thinking, well, they want extra protection against that. If the ball drops, they've got those technicians, those quality players in midfield. And as it was, they kept it for the rest of the game. And the difference here was it meant that Dembele was kind of pressing 1v2, had to do all the pressing on his own. All of a sudden, his job wasn't, can you win the ball back in it instantly, get on top of someone? It's more, can you curve your runs a bit more? Can you cut the pitch in half? And really, as Mark was saying, lock a team down one side. The chance of him actually winning the ball off a goalkeeper or a centre-back, really, he's 1v3 if you count the keeper in that. They're pretty slim. So we can run through the rest of the visualization that we've got, but it's interesting to see how teams tweak up against kind of specific opponents. But then still, as Mark mentions, they'll kind of lock on down one side and try and cut those options, force the ball player into an early pass or a mistake or a long ball, and then they can kind of regain it and play on from there.
I think that's an interesting point as well, which we didn't say about the passes per defensive action, the PPDA. It says about it being a defensive action, but I think to Liam's point there, actually accounting for the fact that you're making a team go long. I know we sort of alluded to it before, but if you're making a team go long and give up maybe the type of possession they typically want, then that's also just as important, because yes, you're not making a defensive action in the metrics per se, but you're regaining it maybe somewhere on the halfway line and then starting to sustain attacks in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to remember, isn't it? It's like, to Liam's point a minute ago, it's not, sometimes a player's role isn't to try and win the ball back. It's simply to change the space that's available. So they were a couple of good teams. What about teams like currently or recently who've been sort of notably less good, shall we say?
Well, I think the PSG example is a really interesting one. I'll probably set you up again for this, Liam, but I think the fact that PSG were so good last season, I don't think it was a coincidence that it was in the season that Kylian Mbappe was no longer there, because I don't think he is the most defensive minded, to put it diplomatically. And I think that is something which Luis Enrique and all sort of really elite coaches appreciate just as much as the on-ball stuff, is to be able to have players who will press from the front. And you mentioned Liverpool before as well. Like those years with Firmino, Mane and Salah, especially Mane and Firmino, he loved the fact that they would just suffocate the opposition and wouldn't let them play out. So I think the fact that PSG are so good is because of Dembele sort of leading the press and the many players going man for man and their athleticism. But I think it sort of contrasts the fact that Kylian Mbappe, obviously now at Real Madrid, Vinicius Junior, I'd include in that as well. Their pressing was not very good last season. I think it's something that Xabi Alonso has been quite vocal in saying that this is something that we're going to sort out. He was probably a bit more diplomatic in saying that, we press as a team. I don't think he wanted to name names, but it's quite clear that he's referring to Vinicius Junior and Kylian Mbappe there. That's right at the elite level, but I suppose we could talk about style as well in terms of those who have a higher PPDA number, which is a proxy for a lower intensity, shall we say. But I don't think that's necessarily saying that they're better or worse. It's just that stylistically they don't wish to quite as much, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. But I do think that PSG contrast is quite interesting.
Yeah, it's hard to do well and hard to sustain over a full season, especially in Europe, which is why Mark mentions how there's teams that will sit back, because it isn't straightforward and it takes a lot to kind of coach. I think a really interesting example, and they were never bad pressers, they were always really good, but Newcastle in their early days under Eddie Howe were, known as a really, really intense team, and they were quite something to watch. And again, we've got another visualization that we'll kind of run through here to show that, but there became some problems at some points with their press. And ironically, it showed when they drew against PSG in the group stage last season, where they'd effectively press from this 4-3-3 with their wingers really, really narrow in line with the centre-backs, leaving the opposition fullbacks completely spare. And the reality was it required their central midfielders, which they could do with Joe Linton especially, to make these huge sprints out to the touchline, these big diagonal sprints to, close that ground and then be able to lock them in and really, really pen them in. And it worked for a period, but I think to do that with a settled team that Eddie Howe likes, and to do that, twice a week all season, and especially, with the European schedule, going away to big teams is really, really hard. And I think it's one of the reasons why they perhaps broke down a little bit the season after. So we're talking about 2023-24 now. There was an interesting stat where they'd ranked really high for overall number of pressures, but I believe there was an Opta stat I was reading in a Sky Sports article that was talking about team pressures, and it was looking at, as Mark mentioned, where two players are pressing together, and they were really low down for that. So it was kind of, they were making these pressures, but not really in a big coordinated manner, because they had players who were kind of going 1v1. I think that became a problem because of the physical demands, and the kind of tweak we've seen now, or at least last season, was going a lot more man-to-man kind of from the start, being prepared to push a centre-back up and say, okay, we're not going to leave those big spaces and try and let those balls happen out wide. I remember when they drew against AC Milan at San Siro, and Mike Mignon, I think, was the Milan goalkeeper that night, and very quickly clocked that the wingers were so narrow and just started chipping balls in behind to the fullbacks, skipped out any short passes, and they had real success. So if you look at Newcastle last season, so 2024-25 to 2023-24, their overall pressing numbers were way down in terms of high turnovers, because they were kind of going man for man and teams were just playing over them more. But their goals against went down by 15. So they were, much better defensively, despite being, at least number wise, kind of like less aggressive. But I think they were better because of it.
I think that shows the tactical intelligence from the players and probably from the instruction from the coaching staff as well, to know when to press and to maybe spot and identify the triggers to go, but also know when to not to as well, to know actually this is going to, I think, because it is a domino effect. If you yourself miss out that first press, then you're taken out of the game and then it just carries on. If you say about those midfielders having to make big, huge jumps, then it is just going to have such a knock-on effect. And you can, as the opposition, quite easily reach at least the middle third, probably the attacking third, just from not anything to do with the physicality of the players that you're playing against, but just the tactical decisions that they're just not doing the press right.
And I guess that's why managers really love players who can kind of spot that mid-game and make little tweaks on the pitch where the managers can't reach. So, obviously, a key role to have in a team. Do clubs need to press? I mean, I can hear some people saying, it's, modern football, everyone's running around. Why can't you just sit back like Stoke and soak up pressure? And, football's a constant, a game where everything kind of flips around a lot. Might we see pressing fall away?
I fear that need is a little bit too philosophical a question of, what must one team do in this life type thing. I think for top teams that like to control games, it's a fundamental part and the best way to kind of get 60 plus kind of % possession and really, really dominate it and control it. And I think it's one of the big reasons why PSG, for instance, last season was so successful on the ball, because it felt like teams never got a rest against them. They couldn't keep the ball for a period. As soon as they won it back, and we'll come on to counter-pressing a bit later on, they'd get counter-pressed from goal kicks. I remember being at Parc des Princes for the first leg of the quarterfinal against Aston Villa, and that first 15-20 minutes, ironically Villa did go 1-0 up about half an hour in, but PSG just pressed the absolute life out of them, and Martinez was just kicking things long left and right. They just could not get out, and you think, you kind of sat up in the press box going, this is a bit of I feel for Aston Villa here a bit. This is a bit of a tough watch. Like this looks really intense. And I think psychologically as much as physically and whatever it might take out of opponents in terms of making them run more or fatigue, it's just kind of that you kind of win the mental battle a little bit if making an opposition feel like you're on top of them, you're in control. I think it's the best way for coaches like Guardiola, Arteta, Maresca that, are risk-averse managers and want that control can get it like that.
And yeah, no, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think the short answer is that no one needs to, but for the reasons that you said, Liam, I think that it's more of a stylistic choice. I think a good example, as I alluded to before, of a team who did well in the Premier League last season, every team still presses to a certain extent, but did less pressing stylistically and played more as a low block team, was Nottingham Forest. It was just that, and also they were elite at counter-attacking and going from their own box to the opposition box. Not all teams are as good at the counter-attacking element. So if you don't press and you're not able to really spring forward, then you're blunt. What are you really, doing to great effect? So I think it's the fact that if you do press and win the ball high up, shall we say, then you're obviously, it goes without saying that you're closer to goal to be able to then try and create a chance, and you've got more bodies around. It also obviously depends on the sort of profile of players that you have in the squad to be able to do that. It's worked for Nottingham Forest because they had elite sprinters and attackers who can maximise those counter-attacking situations. And then again, contrast it to Bournemouth, and they're able to have that physicality and win the ball high up, and then they're closer to goal, and that's their stylistic choice as well.
And I don't know if Chris Wood scores as many goals as he does if you're asking him to press really aggressively, 15, 20 times a game, however many times, like that. Perhaps having them all rest, being able to walk a bit more, not doing as much means you can then be alive in those moments. So,
like Ange Postecoglou might be asking him, you mean?
Yeah. Let's see.
If you're watching this on YouTube and you're thinking, I like this, I want more of this, then make sure to check out the Athletic FC Tactics podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Back to the show. Okay, let's look at how pressing has kind of changed down the years. What would be expected of a team closing down, say, in 2005 compared to 2025?
Well, I think there's more of a league-wide trend of it now. We've seen kind of high turnover numbers go up. There was actually a bit of a drop-off last season. I wondered if that was partly because so many teams went man for man that, we're seeing goalkeeper passes still go down and be shorter, but just fewer instances of, you're not often going to play into a trap where there's a player right up tight on a teammate of yours. So I think we're seeing a mix now of goalkeepers sometimes going long, and we've seen quite a few goalkeeper assists going in behind the press. But I think there's more of a demand from coaches for teams to do it. I think there's a lot of younger coaches now that have come through, either in teams of kind of, high pressing teams, or have perhaps been assistants, or just inspired by coaches that do have their teams press in that kind of way. So I think across the board, it's become accepted as really part of the game. Perhaps Red Bull as well have played a big part in that, and a very physical style that's, helped show that you can do that on a European level or kind of across different clubs. And I think it's the kind of thing that once one or two teams have success with it, even more so than, perhaps like possession football or more stylish stuff, that part of it still feels a little bit, and I'm going to be stereotypical here, like quintessentially English. It's still quite a physical approach to a game. It's not quite winning your duels as such, and, long balls or anything like that. But it's still a thing of, people like to see players, I think, run hard and feel like they're working for the team.
People like closing down.
The people do like closing down. And then I'm like, boy, have I got a sport for you if you like running. But I think, we've seen that real change. And I think it will start to roll back a tiny bit. We see other teams now, Mark mentions Forest being so successful in counter-attacking, that it's not the only way. And also on a physical level, teams that do it quite intensely, i.e. Tottenham last season, got a load of injuries because it's hard to do that. Sports science has caught up a lot and developed a lot, but human biology is not accelerated and can't accelerate at the same rate. So there's always going to be that lag where you go, probably can't ask Mickey van der Ven to make 40 high-intensity sprints twice a week.
I mean, forgive me if this is kind of what you're already alluding to as well, Liam, but I do think there's an extent to which, when we're talking about kind of the history of football, that the connection between what a team looks to do in possession then influences what a team does out of possession, and then that influences what a team does in possession, etc. And that cycle kind of continues. So I think when there's been more of a move towards shorter passing, it becomes a bit more kind of predictable, that the patterns that a team is looking to do. Therefore, you can maybe try and coordinate a press accordingly. But maybe in a 2005, yes, of course, there was patterns and there was sequences of play, etc. But you were more likely maybe to go long sometimes, and to become more of a duel. So it was a bit more kind of fragmented in that regard. So I do think there's a connection between what is going on in possession, out of possession, and then now, as a consequence, maybe teams are going more long because teams are getting better out of possession at being able to read what's going on, and the cycle.
It's so cyclical. And Jose Mourinho's reserve goalie at Porto was Nuno Espirito Santo. So these things last. But we're seeing pressing being enacted at all levels now, from the top of the Champions League all the way through to non-league football, kids football, which begs the question: how hard is it to coach pressing structures? Because presumably there are different levels to it.
I mean, hard because it's very physically demanding, right? So you've got to actually coach that side of it before you even think about tactically, how can I get players to run at the right times and all work together. Some interesting numbers from Skill Corner that we had at the end of last season was that compared to 6 seasons ago, in 2024-25, sprinting was up 19% in terms of frequency and 22% in terms of distance. So that's pretty big rise, over not a huge period of time. And interestingly, within that, overall running distance was only up 6% in that time. So it was kind of disproportionately sprinting more, not just loads and loads of running further. It's not purely aimless, we're going to run all the time. It's, we're going to sprint when we need to and press really hard and really, really aggressively. And that was interesting because after 4 years of high turnovers having gone up, last season it finally went down for the first time in 5 years. So that was kind of a weird mix of saying we've got a lot of sprinting, but also maybe we're sprinting and force them to kick long. It's not always going to end in kind of a final third regain. There's a great paper that I'd encourage people to go and read. It's linked in the Tactical Trends piece that I wrote at the end of last season that people can find on site. And it looks at from the 1970s all the way through to the 2010s, kind of like body mass, height, weight, and different things for players, using interesting kind of football yearbook data, and basically just point out that there's this massive, what they call a J-shaped trend to show the big spike up in terms of players and kind of their body types. They use a metric called RPI. It's a similar thing to BMI, body mass index, but it's kind of a more robust measurement to basically say footballers are just incredibly physically fit now, like way more than they were a period of time ago, which brings me on to the point kind of about how hard it is to coach pressing structures. Once you've done that bit, the theoretically easy bit of just make them fit, it's something that I saw a lot when watching Bournemouth last season and thought they were a really interesting example of how hard it is to do, where it's not just the first person that presses, it's how kind of the players back them up and follow them, your secondary and kind of tertiary or third presses. And again, there's another visualization that we've got. The way they'd start of kind of bumping up the number 10 to press from what looks like a 4-1-5 or a 4-1-3-2 kind of type shape, where the number the number 10 goes forward and one of the midfielders from deeper comes up and stands basically between the two opposition midfielders and is technically marking no one or marking space for the time being. And depending on where the ball goes, they kind of slide en masse. There's lots of jumps that will happen. So for instance, we have them playing out to the right centre-back, they'll lock on. And you then get the winger, a phrase that I've heard Eddie Howe use, kind of the opposite wide man out of possession. So the furthest away will slide across into the middle. This is what Mark was saying earlier. You then back yourselves to say, well, if you want to switch it all the way out, that's fine. You can do that. That's the least valuable pass, but we're going to all lock on and slide across. So it's having that coordination, because when one person jumps or one midfielder slides, you need the other person to basically already be running. Otherwise that space is going to open, and that even half a second is enough for a pass to go in, be bounced out one touch, and then move across the other way around. So, you get these big coordinated jumps where you might get the winger going to the fullback, the defensive midfielder jumping to the midfielder, and then a centre back stepping up. And that needs to happen not just once from the initial goal kick or the initial sequence, but often it's when teams play back round and recycle it where they don't quite get it right on the second time round. And I thought that was something Bournemouth were excellent at last season, and big credit to Iraola and Bournemouth for not sacking him early on.
I was going to say, obviously he started quite slowly, and there were numerous Bournemouth players who said, we're still getting used to what he wants from us. And it took him, 10 games-ish for that to really kick in? Yeah. And we are at that point in the season, aren't we, where a lot of fans are sort of, we need to give the manager 10 games. But I think it is a valid amount of minutes, because it does often take that long.
For a pressing team as well, I go, that's fair enough. It's a bit different if you're maybe a bit more of a sit deeper, and if you've got a style which isn't not easy to coach, but a bit less tactically complex, where I'd say for pressing, you go, this takes months, it can take seasons to coach, especially when you've got a squad churn and turnover. So that, I goes, if you're going to give anyone time, you'd give Iraola time for that.
So the sport's still called football. It's not press ball yet. So the idea is not just to win the ball back. It's doing something with it when you won it back. So who are the best teams at converting winning the ball back into profitable situations?
Yeah, I mean, before I kind of go into the numbers, it goes back to what we said before about the pressing itself, is that it is often a stylistic choice. Like, some people want to kind of thrive in the chaos of maybe regaining the ball high up when the opposition aren't in maybe a shape that they want to be in a transitional moment. Some are more comfortable, like a Manchester City being the obvious one, they'll win the ball as quickly as they can, but then they'll look to kind of get back into their rest defense, their shape that they want to be in possession, to make sure that they can then try and instill those sequences and patterns that they normally do. So anything from here on in is kind of more of a stylistic approach than necessarily saying they're better or worse. But I've got a visualization that looks to show the share of shots. We're talking about, again, that attacking 60% of the pitch, but the share of shots that have been taken by teams within 10 seconds of regaining the ball. So a bit of a time window to show when they get it back, what do they do with it, and how often do they look to get a shot at the end of it. And interestingly, the team that we've been speaking about a lot in this episode is Nottingham Forest. They top the list across the top 4 European leagues, but there's a lot of kind of familiar names for different reasons, actually, that are there as well. Crystal Palace being another one, who are pretty vertical when they can. They've got the athleticism. They've got players who can play off Jean-Philippe Mateta to then sort of run in behind. Liverpool, and again, we've spoken about them a lot, but specifically last season, a team who actually, for all that Arne Slot was trying to calm things down a little bit and have a bit more sort of a pause on the ball, they were really strong in their transitional style, which was still a bit of a, I was going to say hangover, but still kind of from the Klopp era in a good way, in a positive sense. So I think this is the top 20 across Europe's top four leagues, but it just shows who look to go really quick. And just staying with the Premier League, I mentioned it before, this is a visualization that looks to show how transitional a side are. And again, Liverpool and Nottingham Forest near the top in both the share of first passes forward and their sprint. So it brings together everything we spoke about before in terms of the athleticism and intensity when they do win the ball back, but also kind of the intention of what the team wants to do. So that's more a tactical instruction, as I say, when you look at Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. You compare that with Manchester City, as I did before, Southampton as their poor man's imitation of a Manchester City side last season, being two sides that stand out at the opposite end to be like, okay, well, when we do win the ball back, irrespective of how quick we do it, we actually want to just circulate possession again and start again. And we actually don't want to thrive off those transitional moments, just, again, purely stylistic. So I think that's interesting to show who's inclined to use pressing as a way to create chances and those who aren't.
It's interesting, I think, because as Liam touched on, I think there is a sort of there's a sort of English essence to sort of, pressing high and winning the ball back. And I think both City and Southampton fan bases were at points a bit fed up last season with, how passive they could be at certain points. So it's quite interesting to see that represented in that graphic. Let's briefly talk about counter pressing. So can you explain the difference, and also then, who's good at it? Why they're good at it, and the best ways to do it?
Well, I'd say definitionally, is that even a word? Definitionally, we'll go for it. I'd say it's the same as what we mentioned before about being a coordinated effort and often one or more players. But this is, rather than typically being in settled, you talk about a settled possession for an opposition team and a general pressing sequence, often from their goalkeeper. This is immediately after a team has lost the ball themselves. So they are, I don't really know why it's called counter pressing, because they're not really going against pressing. It's like countering by pressing, but they're doing it immediately in response to losing the ball, trying to either win it back immediately, stop a counter attack. It's something, again, we've seen very much popularized by Liverpool teams, been a big part of Guardiola's teams, Barcelona, Bayern Munich and Manchester City. So yeah, that's all about, I think, just being very quick, being very reactive, what people might have historically called winning it back very quickly. It's not, again, not another new thing. It's just a different term, slightly more continental term for a pre-existing concept.
I think it's interesting to look at the type of teams who counter press and kind of the reason why they do it. And I've actually got this graphic that looks at the share of regains within 8 seconds of losing the ball. So again, a bit of a time window to say, okay, well, who's more inclined to try and get it back as quickly as they can. And on that list, I think it is interesting to see, as I say, stylistically, who does more of what. So Bayern Munich are at the top here, which I think is interesting because they are themselves in the Bundesliga a possession dominant team. So I think the reason that they counter press so well is because on the ball, they'll get bodies close to each other such that, and often to Liam's point before, tire the opposition with their possession dominance, such that when the opposition do win it back, they're in a really strong position. Again, we could go into rest defense for a whole other episode, but they're in a really strong shape to be able to win it back quickly and counter press. And within this graphic, you could probably level the same in the top 5 or 6. Barcelona is a similar instance. Leverkusen under Xabi Alonso last season as well, as teams who look after possession, tire the opposition, win it back quickly, versus a Mainz or maybe an RB Leipzig, Rayo Vallecano, who are just intense pressers and almost maniacs when they don't have the ball, and will just really try to counter press, because it's like an Iraola Bournemouth who tries to just instill that style. So that in itself, I think, is really interesting to contrast within that list. But then I've also got this graphic that puts the two graphics that I previously spoken about together onto a scatter plot in terms of the share of shots taken within 10 seconds of a regain and that share of regains within 8 seconds of losing the ball. And you can look to see who tries to do things quickly and maybe who doesn't. And I'm speaking about Leverkusen, just starting on that left-hand side there, that they do like to regain the ball quickly, but they are much like a Manchester City style. They will then start to then get their patterns going again and have that sort of slower transition forward. They're not looking to go for the throw after they win it back. Then at the other end, more to the extreme, we've got the Nottingham Forest and Crystal Palace example that I gave, and Rayo Vallecano and Barcelona probably more because of their attacking quality. Vallecano maybe a little bit more stylistically, a la Iraola's Bournemouth. Look to try and regain it quickly and then go forward at pace and then profit from those sort of transitional moments as well. So even just by showing this graphic, it shows that, as I mentioned before, it's more of a stylistic thing rather than who's necessarily better or worse at it.
Yeah, seeing Forest and Palace at the very edge of that on the right-hand side is the teams that really transition really quickly and really aggressively was really, really interesting. From very different shapes as well, but kind of similar kind of principles. Forest, I had a quick look at the numbers last season, had the most goals in total within 15 seconds of an open play high turnover. So it had 12 goals. I think that was also partly down to personnel. So they'd be, had good passers that could play those big vertical passes forward. We saw on matchday 1 of this season, great through ball by Elliot Anderson for Chris Wood. As soon as that turnover happens, Chris Wood is he's already running before Elliot Anderson's even made the pass. But likewise, they had Callum Hudson-Odoi as well, who was just very inclined to shoot early. I think perhaps the fact that they didn't really risk too many bodies forwards in terms of the press meant that they often didn't have many other options but to shoot sometimes. And their style was saying, okay, we're often heading games, we're prepared to sit back and be defensive. we can shoot from 30 yards. We don't mind if they have another goal kick again. It's very different to perhaps a Guardiola team who might say, we want to be patient, keep the ball, keep possession, keep territory. As Mark goes to make the point, you can press and actually counter press or use what you get from the regain in very different ways. It depends on how you want to play.
And I guess that's why we all love football so much, is that there's many, many ways to play the game, to set up. And, with a club like Nottingham Forest, we now get to see them under a different manager and see what he changes and maybe what he keeps the same, because, as these numbers and discussion has shown, I think they were pretty effective last season. So that's it for today. A huge thank you to Mark and Liam. And thanks to you on YouTube for watching along. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and make sure you check out the Athletic FC Tactics podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Michael Bailey will be back for our regular Thursday show very soon.